The wagon was already tipping when she stepped under it. 2,000 pounds of green fur sliding off a rig that had lost its brake on the river grade, and every man on that hill had jumped clear, shouting, running, saving themselves the way men do when the world starts coming apart. Every man but the one pinned at the front axle with his boot caught in the tongue, screaming a name that wasn't his own. And into that gap, into the place where the load was coming down like the side of a mountain deciding to lie down, walked a woman they had spent 3 months calling names behind her broad back. She did not run. She did not ride. She walked, slow and sure, planted her shoulder against the stack, set her boots in the mud, and took the weight of it on her own body, while the men stood frozen and stared. They would talk about that moment for the rest of their lives. Most of them would lie about where they'd been standing. But before we get to the hill, and the timber, and the hard, cruel arithmetic of a town that had already decided what a woman like her was worth, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever kitchen or porch or quiet room you're sitting in, tell me the name of your town down in the comments, so I know who's traveling with me tonight. And if a story about being underestimated and then being seen is the kind of story you've been needing, then stay with me to the end, because this one earns its ending slow, the way the good things always do. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to a muddy road in a timber country most maps had never bothered to name, and to a woman walking into it with everything she owned on her back and nothing in this world waiting for her at the other end of the road. Her name was Delphine Rourke, though nobody in the story I'm about to tell you ever called her that. They called her Della when they were being kind, and a great many other things when they were not. She came into the town of Slater's Bend on foot in the last cold week of a wet October, in the year the railroads were still deciding whether the little timber towns of that river valley were worth the iron it would take to reach them. She was tall, taller than most of the men she would soon be working beside, and she was broad through the shoulders and broad through the hips and heavy in a way that the world had taught her from the time she was a girl to apologize for. She had learned the apology so young that she no longer hurt herself making it. It lived in the way she took up less room at a table than her body needed, in the way she turned sideways through a doorway even when the doorway was wide, in the way she never once in her life had asked a person to make room for her. She carried a canvas roll and a wooden toolbox with a rope handle, and the toolbox was the heavier of the two, and she carried it in the hand that hurt less. She was 39 years old. She had buried a husband, and she had buried the 2 people who might have called her daughter, and she had walked away from a town on the dry side of the mountains where the only work left for a woman her age and her size was the kind of work that asked her to disappear. She had done a great many kinds of work in her life. She had never once done the kind that asked her to disappear, and she was too old now to start. So she walked. The road into Slater's Bend followed the river, and the river that autumn was fat and brown and loud, hauling the mountain's rain down toward a sea she had never seen. And along its banks, the town had thrown itself up out of raw lumber the way those towns did, fast and ugly and full of hope. There was a mill at the water's edge that never fully stopped, a great shrieking heart of a building that turned the forest into money, one board at a time. And the whole valley smelled of cut pine and wet sawdust and wood smoke, a smell she would come to love before she understood that she loved it. There was a main street of plank walks and mud, a store, a chapel not yet finished, a boarding house, and 2 saloons that were finished before anything else. And there were men everywhere, because the timber country was a country of men, men with axes and men with saws and men with the particular loneliness of people who have gone somewhere hard to earn something they are not sure they will live to spend. She felt their eyes the moment she came off the river road and onto the plank walk, and she did what she had always done. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she gave them nothing to feed on. Not fear, not shame, not the small pleading smile that some women learned to wear like armor. She had tried that smile once, a long time ago, and it had not protected her from anything. And so she had put it down like a tool that didn't work, and she had never picked it up again. A boy on a barrel called out something about the size of her, and a couple of men laughed the easy, ugly laugh of men who are bored. And she walked on past them as though they were weather, as though they were only the rain. And, in a way, to her, they were. She had weathered worse. She was looking for two things. She was looking for a dry place to sleep, and she was looking for a man named Amos Colter. Because a teamster 3 towns back, a decent old man with a broken hand, had told her that if she was fool enough to want honest work in the timber, there was a widower down at Slater's Bend who hauled lumber from the mill to the river landing, and who had just lost the last of his hands to the bigger outfit, and who was either going to hire the next warm body that came up his road or lose his contract by the first snow. The old teamster had looked at her a long moment before he said the rest of it. He had said, "They won't none of them work for Colter, on account of what happened to his people, and on account of Renfrew leaning on him. So a body that needs work bad enough might do worse than a man who needs help bad enough." And then he had looked at her hands, at the size of them and the scars on them and the way she held them. And he had said the thing that made her decide to walk the last 20 miles instead of waiting for a wagon. He had said, "You'll do more work than any 2 of the boys he lost." She had not thanked him. She was not in the habit of thanking people for the truth, because the truth had never cost anyone anything to give her. But she had remembered it, the way she remembered every kindness, filed away small and careful in the place where she kept the few she'd been given. And so on that gray October afternoon, Delphine Rourke walked the length of Slater's Bend with a town's worth of eyes on her back. And she found the road that ran down to the river landing, and she followed it toward a sagging barn and a sway-backed house and a corral where 2 of the biggest, saddest, most beautiful draft horses she had ever seen stood hip-shot in the rain, waiting for a man who had almost stopped believing anyone was coming. She did not know yet that she was that someone. She only knew that her feet hurt, and that the horses were well kept even though the fences weren't, and that a man who kept his horses better than his fences was a man worth knocking on the door for. So she set down her toolbox in the mud, and she flexed the ache out of her hand, and she went to find out. The dog found her first. It came around the corner of the barn, low and quick, a big, rough-coated thing the color of wet slate, and it stopped 6 feet from her with its hackles up and a growl building in its chest. And Della did the thing she always did with dogs, which was nothing. She did not reach for it. She did not speak sweet at it. She did not back away. She stood square in the mud with her weight even on both feet, and she let the dog do the deciding. Because in her experience, dogs, like people, resented having their minds made up for them. The growl faltered. The dog took one stiff step, then another, and it put its nose against the back of her still hand and breathed her in, the leather and the wood smoke and the 20 miles of road. And then it did a thing that a man watching from the barn door would tell his neighbors about later. Because that dog had bitten 3 of the last 4 men who'd come down that road looking for work. It leaned its whole weight against her leg and looked up at her, and its tail moved, once, slow, like it wasn't sure it remembered how. And the man in the barn door lowered the axe handle he'd picked up without thinking, and he stepped out into the gray light to get a look at whatever it was his dog had just forgiven on sight. That was how Della Rourke and Amos Colter met. Not with words, with a dog making up its mind faster than either of them would let themselves. Amos Colter was 44 years old and looked older, the way grief ages a man in the face before it ever touches his hair. He was lean and weathered and quiet, with the kind of stillness that some people mistook for slowness, and that the ones who knew him understood to be the opposite. A man who had learned to hold everything so tightly that from the outside it looked like he was holding nothing at all. He stood in the barn door with the rain coming off the eave and a thin gray curtain between them, and he looked at the woman in his yard, at her size and her soaked canvas coat and the toolbox at her feet, and he did not laugh, and he did not sneer, and he did not do any of the small, dismissing things that Della had braced herself against on the long walk down from the road. He just looked at her the way he looked at everything, carefully, taking the measure of it. And then he looked down at his dog, leaning against her leg, and something moved behind his tired eyes that might have been surprise, and might have been something older and more careful than that. "He don't take to people," Amos said. It was the first thing he ever said to her. His voice was low and even and worn smooth. "No," Della agreed. "Most don't." And that was nearly the end of the conversation, because Amos Colter was not a man who filled silences, and neither was she, and the two of them stood there in the rain long enough that the moment should have gotten awkward, and somehow didn't. Finally he said, "You're looking for work." It wasn't a question. There was no other reason for a soul to be standing in that yard. "I'm looking for Amos Colter," she said. "You found him." "Man up the valley told me you haul lumber. Mill to the landing. Told me you lost your hands." Something tightened at the corner of Amos's jaw at that. A small flinch he covered fast, and Della saw it and filed it away and did not touch it. "Told me you might need somebody who will actually do the work," she finished, "instead of somebody who will stand around telling you why it can't be done." The ghost of something crossed Amos's face then. Not quite a smile, more the memory of where a smile used to go. "That's so," he said. "That's so." He looked at her a long moment more. The rain filled the silence. Down at the landing, the river worked and worked at the bank, patient and endless. And somewhere up the hill, the mill's saw bit into a log with a scream that rose and held and fell. "You know what the work is," Amos said at last. "Loading green lumber onto a freight wagon, driving a 4-horse team down a river grade that's killed 2 men I know of, stacking at the landing so the rafts can take it down river before the water drops. It's 12 hours when it's easy. It's 16 when it ain't. It's wet, and it's heavy, and it don't stop for weather nor for Sunday if the river's right for running." He paused. "Men half your—" and here he stopped himself and chose the word, and Della respected him for the choosing. "Men that come up this road, strong and young, have quit it by noon." "I don't quit things by noon," Della said. Amos Colter looked at her, and for the first time he really saw her. Not the size of her that the town would never see past, but the thing underneath it. The flat, certain steadiness in her voice, the way she'd said it not as a boast, but as a plain fact about herself, the way you'd say the color of your own eyes. And Amos, who had spent a year now watching strong young men look at his grief and his sagging barn and his hard river grade and decide he was a dead operation not worth their trouble, felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the small, dangerous flicker of hope. He put it down fast. He had learned to put it down fast. But he'd felt it. "Pays $1.50 a day," he said, "which is less than Renfrew's mill pays, and I won't pretend otherwise. Boards the loft over the tack room, which is dry, which is more than I can say for the barn. And I'll be honest with you, because you walked 20 miles and you're owed honesty." He looked out at the rain, at the two big horses standing patient in the corral. "This outfit might not last the winter. There's a man in this town wants what I got, and he's got more ways to take it than I got ways to keep it. You might work your back raw for me and watch it all go under come spring anyhow. So if you got a better prospect somewhere, you ought to take it." Della Rourke looked at the barn and the fences and the beautiful, sad horses, and the man who had just talked himself out of his own help because he thought honesty required it. And she thought about the dry side of the mountains and the work that asked her to disappear, and the long list of towns behind her that had looked at her body and never once looked at her hands. "I don't have a better prospect," she said. "I don't have any prospect at all, and I'd rather sink a good boat than sail a rotten one." She picked up her toolbox. "Where do you want me to start?" That first evening, she did not start with the lumber. She started with the fences, because a woman who has spent her life being told she is too much of one thing learns early to be more of every other thing, useful and quiet and impossible to send away. And because she had seen with one glance that the corral rails were rotted at the posts, and that those two good horses were one bad night from being loose on a road that killed men. Amos told her supper was at dark, and to rest, and she said she would. And then she went and got her toolbox and walked the corral in the failing light, running her scarred hand along each rail, testing the give of each post with her shoulder. And by the time the dark came down, she had a plan for the fence in her head the way another person might have a tune. She came in wet to the bone, and Amos had made a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread. Plain food. The food of a man cooking for one who has forgotten it can be anything else. And they ate it at a table that had 4 chairs and needed only 2, and neither of them said much. The dog lay against the stove with one eye open, watching her. When the meal was done, she stood and gathered the plates before he could, and washed them in the basin. And it was such a small thing, such an ordinary domestic thing, that Amos Colter had to get up and go stand in the doorway with his back to her and look out at the dark. Because the last hands to wash a plate in that house had been a woman 4 years dead, and the sound of it, the plain, small sound of a person moving in his kitchen, undid something in his chest that he had spent 4 years tying tight. Della heard the catch in his breath. She did not turn around. She had a great and rare gift, which was the ability to let a person have their grief in the same room without making them perform it for her. And she used it now, and she went on washing the plates and let him stand in the door until his breathing evened out. Neither of them ever spoke of it, but she knew from that first night, in the way you know weather coming, that whatever had happened to Amos Colter had taken more from him than a pair of hands. And he knew from that first night that the woman his dog had forgiven was not a body he had hired, but a person who had walked into his house, and that the two things were not the same, and that he was in some quiet danger he did not yet have the strength to name. Dawn in the timber country came slow and gray, the light seeping up out of the river fog before the sun had any say in it, and Della Rourke was up before it, because she had been up before the light every day of her working life, and her body no longer knew how to do otherwise. She had the fire going before Amos came down, and coffee on, and when he came into the kitchen buttoning his coat and found her already dressed with the mud of the corral on her boots, he stopped and looked at the coffee and looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the thing itself. They drank the coffee standing up. Then they went out into the gray to hitch the team, and that was the morning Della Rourke first put her hands on the work that would remake her life. And it was the morning Amos Colter first understood that the woman the town was already sharpening its tongue on knew more about his own trade than the last 4 men he'd hired combined. The team was 4 horses, 2 big bays, and a black and a gray, and they were, Amos said, more temperamental than they looked, and the black in particular had put a man in the river last spring. Della walked into the corral among them the way she'd stood for the dog, giving them her stillness, letting them come to her, running her hands down the black's neck and along his shoulder and down the great column of his leg. And the black, who had put a man in the river, dropped his head and blew out a long, soft breath against her chest. And Amos Colter stood at the gate and felt the morning go strange around him. "Where'd you learn horses?" he said. "My father freighted," Della said. "Or mostly. Mountain roads worse than yours. He had a bad leg by the time I was 10, so—" She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Amos understood the shape of the thing she'd left unsaid. A girl of 10 doing a crippled man's work because there was no one else. Learning a hard trade in a hard country before she was old enough to know it was supposed to be hard. And he understood something else, too, which was that everything she'd told him was the smallest possible piece of a much longer story, offered plain, without pity, the way she seems to offer everything. They hitched the team and drove the empty freight wagon up the river grade to the mill in the raw first light, and Della sat the box beside Amos and watched his hands on the lines and the way he took the grade, and she said once, quietly, "You favor the near side coming down." "Road's washed on the off side," Amos said. "I know," she said. "But you're bracing the whole team against the wash instead of letting the wheel horse feel for it, and the black feels you not trusting him, and that's half your trouble on this hill." Amos Colter did not answer that. He drove the rest of the way up in silence, but Della saw his jaw work, and she knew she'd told him a true thing he hadn't wanted to hear from a stranger on her first morning, and she braced for the flare of temper that most men would have given her. It didn't come. Instead, at the top of the grade, before they rolled into the mill yard, Amos Colter handed her the lines. Just handed them across, without a word, the 4 leather lines that were his whole living, and looked at her. And it was the loudest thing anyone had said to Della Rourke in a very long time. She took them. She took the team into the mill yard herself, and she brought the big wagon around under the loading chute clean and square on the first try, tight enough that the mill hands would not have to walk an extra step to load her, and up in the yard a knot of those mill hands stopped what they were doing to watch the enormous new woman drive Colter's killer team like she'd been born on the box. And that was the morning the town of Slater's Bend first got a good long look at Della Rourke. And that was the morning Silas Renfrew, who owned the mill and the chute and the loading yard and a great deal of the town, and who intended to own the river landing before the spring, first heard that broke old Amos Colter had gone and hired himself a woman. The loading of green lumber is a brutal art, and Della Rourke turned out to be a master of it, and the mastery did not come from strength alone, though she had that, more than the mill hands wanted to admit. It came from knowing wood. It came from a lifetime of understanding how weight wants to move, and how a load wants to ride, and where the balance of a thing truly lives as opposed to where it looks like it lives. The mill hands, at Renfrew's yard, had a habit with the new haulers, and the habit was to load them badly on purpose, to stack a wagon so that it looked full and rode wrong, top-heavy or slung too far back, so the greenhorn would get out on the grade and feel the whole world start to sway and either wreck or come crawling back white-faced. And it gave the mill hands something to laugh about at dinner. They tried it with Della on that first morning. They stacked her high and stacked her wrong, and they leaned on the chute and grinned, waiting. Della walked the length of the loaded wagon once, slow, with her hand trailing along the stack. Then she walked it back. Then she climbed up and without a word she began pulling the top courses down and restacking them herself, throwing green fir planks that weighed as much as a boy each, throwing them easy, throwing them steady, resetting the whole load lower and further forward over the front axle where it belonged. And she did it fast, and she did it right, and the grins on the chute went stiff and then went away. A big mill hand named Boyd, who had done the bad stacking, pushed off the chute and swaggered over. "That's how we load 'em here," he said. "The load rides how I say it rides," Della said, not stopping, not looking at him, throwing another plank into place. "It's my grade to come down, not yours." "Big talk," Boyd said. "From a—" And here he used one of the words, the ugly ones, the ones about her body, loud, for the yard to hear, and the yard laughed. Della set down the plank in her hands. She turned around. She was standing up on the wagon bed so that she looked down at Boyd. And she was not angry, or if she was, she had folded the anger down so small and so cold that it came out of her as something worse than anger, which was patience. "You loaded me top-heavy and slung back," she said, quiet, so that the yard had to go still to hear her, "on a killing grade, hoping I'd wreck for your dinner story. That's not a joke, friend. That's a man trying to get somebody hurt because he didn't like the look of them." She let that sit. The yard had gone very quiet. "Now, you can call me whatever you need to call me to feel all right about the size of your own self. I've heard all of it, and from better men than you. And it never once loaded a wagon or drove a grade or earned $1. Wood doesn't lie. Either it holds or it doesn't. And a man doesn't lie either in the end. Either he holds or he doesn't. And I know already which kind you are, because the first thing you did with a stranger was try to hurt them for sport." Boyd had no answer for that. There is no answer for the plain truth said plainly by someone who is not afraid of you. He stood there, red-faced, while the yard looked at him, and then he did what men like Boyd do, which was mutter and walk off. And Della turned back to her load and finished it. And up on the office porch above the yard, a man in a clean coat stood watching the whole thing with a still and careful interest, the way a man watches a horse he is thinking about buying or breaking. That was Silas Renfrew. He was not a big man, nor a loud one. He was neat and pale and precise, with soft, clean hands and a soft, even voice. And he ran the biggest timber outfit in that stretch of the valley, and he had gotten it not by working harder than other men, but by being more patient than them, by waiting always for the moment when a man got hurt or got sick or got behind, and then buying what that man had for less than it was worth and smiling while he did it. He had been waiting a year now for Amos Colter to go under. Colter's little freight outfit was the last piece Renfrew needed, because Colter held the old landing rights on the best low stretch of the river, the only stretch where you could raft lumber out cheap all the way to the coast, and Renfrew wanted those rights the way he wanted air. He had leaned on Colter every way a patient man can lean. He had raised his loading fees, he had poached his hands with better wages, he had waited for grief to finish the job. And now, grief-stricken, broke old Amos Colter had gone and hired the strangest, largest, most unlikely hand in the valley, and she had just faced down Boyd in front of the whole yard, and Silas Renfrew watched her throw the last plank into place and settle the load square and true. And he did a small thing with his mouth that was not a smile. He had plans to have Colter finished by Christmas. He recalculated. He was a patient man. He could wait a little longer. But he made a note, in the cold ledger of his mind where he kept the accounts of people, that the woman would have to be dealt with. She drove the load down the grade that morning clean as glass. Amos rode beside her and did not touch the lines, and she took the killing hill the way she'd told him it wanted to be taken, letting the black wheel horse feel for the washed edge, keeping the weight low and forward where she'd stacked it, riding the brake in long, even pressures instead of the panicked grabs that had rolled other men. And at the bottom, at the river landing, she brought it around and set it, and looked at Amos. And Amos looked at the load. And Amos said, "Huh." It was not much, but she was learning already that in the timber country, out of certain mouths, "huh" was a whole speech. And out of Amos Colter's mouth in particular, it was as close to praise as the weather in a drought is to rain. They unloaded together, and she stacked the landing yard the way she'd stacked the wagon, tight and true, sorting the lumber by length as she went without being asked, so that when the raft crews came, they'd find it ready. And Amos watched her do a day and a half of work in a morning, and said nothing, and thought a great deal. At noon, they sat on the landing dock and ate the bread and cold meat Amos had brought, and the river ran by fat and brown at their feet, and the dog lay between them with its chin on Della's boot. And for a while, nobody said anything, and it was a good nothing, an easy nothing, the kind of shared quiet that most people go their whole lives without finding even once. Then Amos said, looking at the river, not at her, "That thing you said to Boyd, about holding." "What about it?" "Nothing," Amos said. Then, after a while, "It was true, is all." Della understood that he was not talking about Boyd anymore. She understood that Amos Colter had been asking himself for a year now, in the long gray hours, whether he was the kind of man who holds or the kind who doesn't. Whether staying on this failing outfit and fighting Renfrew for a landing he could barely keep was holding or was just stubbornness. Whether a man who had lost what Amos had lost had any business holding on to anything at all. She understood all of that from 4 words and the way he wouldn't look at her. And she did not offer him comfort, because comfort was cheap, and he would have heard the cheapness in it. Instead, she said the truest thing she had. "The wood doesn't decide whether it holds," she said. "It just does or it doesn't, based on what it's made of and how it was treated. Same with people, mostly. You don't decide to be the kind that holds. You find out you are, usually about the time everything's coming down." Amos Colter turned his head and looked at her then. Really looked. And Della let him. And something passed between the two of them on that landing dock in the noon light that neither of them had words for, and neither of them tried to find words for. It was not a large thing yet. It was the size of a coal you carry cupped in your hands out of an old fire, hoping to start a new one, not sure yet if it's still lit. But it was there. And then Amos, who could not sit inside a feeling that size for very long, cleared his throat and stood and said they had 2 more loads to run before dark, and the moment folded itself up and put itself away, and they went back to work. But he had looked at her, and she had let him. And the dog had watched them both with its old, wise eyes. And if a dog can be satisfied about the arrangement of the world, that dog was. The trouble started small, the way Renfrew always started things. So small you could tell yourself you were imagining it. First, it was the loading fees. Colter paid Renfrew's mill a fee to load off the mill's chute, because Colter had no mill of his own, only the freight rights and the landing. And one morning, the fee had gone up, quietly, a note pinned to the chute. And it had gone up just enough to eat most of the margin on every load Della hauled. Amos read the note and folded it and put it in his coat and said nothing. But Della saw his hands, and she knew. Then it was the loading itself. Where before the mill hands had loaded Colter's wagon in turn like everyone else's, Now Colter's wagon waited. It waited while other outfits loaded ahead of it, waited while the good early light burned off, waited while the mill hands found reasons to be slow, so that Della, who could run 4 loads in a day, was lucky to run 2, and 2 loads at the new fee barely paid the horse's feed. It was all deniable. It was all just business, just the ordinary friction of a busy yard. And if Amos complained, he'd sound like a bitter old man imagining slights. And Renfrew knew that. And that was the art of it. Della watched it happen for 3 days. On the 4th, she did a thing she did not tell Amos she was going to do. She got to the mill yard in the black dark before the mill hands, before even the sawyers, and she loaded the wagon herself, off the cold chute by lantern light, throwing the green planks alone in the freezing dark, so that by the time Boyd and the others swaggered in at dawn, Colter's wagon was already loaded, already square, already pulling out of the yard, and there was nothing for them to be slow about. She did it the next day, too, and the next. She got up at an hour that would have broken most men, and she loaded her own wagon in the dark, so that Renfrew's slowness had nothing to bite on. And she never said a word about it. And when Amos found out, on the 3rd morning, when he came up early and found her alone in the lantern-lit yard throwing lumber with her breath smoking in the cold, he stood at the edge of the light and watched her for a long moment. And something in his face broke and reformed into something harder and warmer at the same time. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," said Della, throwing a plank. "That's twice the work." "It's the work that needs doing," she said. "So it's the work I'm doing." And she threw another plank, and Amos came into the light and picked up the other end of the next one, and they loaded the rest of it together in the dark without another word. 2 people who had each learned long ago that talk was cheap, and that the realest things a person could say were said with their hands. Up in the still dark town, in the warm office where he took his early coffee, Silas Renfrew heard that the Colter woman was loading her own wagon before dawn to beat his slowdown. And he set down his cup, and he was quiet for a while. He had expected her to complain. Complainers were easy. You could wait a complainer out. You could let the town decide he was bitter. You could watch him rage himself hollow. He had not expected her to simply get up earlier and outwork the problem in silence. That was harder to fight, because it made her look good, and it made him look small. And Silas Renfrew's whole power in that valley rested on never looking small. So Silas Renfrew changed his methods, the way a patient man does. And he reached for the other tool, the one he liked best, the one that cost him nothing and could not be traced back to his clean, soft hands. He reached for the town's tongue. That evening, and the evenings after, in the 2 saloons and the store and the half-built chapel and the kitchens where the timber wives traded news, a story began to move. It was not a loud story. Renfrew's stories were never loud. It was just a wondering, passed mouth to mouth, a soft, respectable wondering about what exactly a widower like Amos Colter was doing with a woman like that, living out at his place. The 2 of them alone down at the landing. No chaperone, no arrangement anybody had heard blessed by the chapel. And wasn't it a shame? And wasn't it a little bit strange? And what would his poor dead wife think? And hadn't grief maybe unsettled the poor man's judgment? And of course nobody was saying anything. Nobody was saying anything at all. They were only wondering. And that kind of wondering Della Rourke knew, because she had been the subject of that kind of wondering in every town she had ever lived in, was the most dangerous kind of talk there was. Because you could not fight it. You could not face it in the yard like you faced Boyd. You could not throw it down and restack it right. It had no shoulder to plant against. It came at you like water, finding every low place. And no fence you could build would stop it. The woman who carried the water furthest was named Prudence Hallett, and she was the wife of the man who ran the store. And she was not a cruel woman, which was the thing Della came to understand about her only much later, and which is the thing I want you to understand now, because it matters to the end of this. Prudence Hallett was not cruel. She was frightened, in the way that respectable women in hard places are often frightened, of anything that did not fit the small, tight shape she had been taught the world was supposed to hold. Because if the shape could bend for someone else, then it could bend for her. And she had given up too much to fit inside it to bear the thought that the fitting had been for nothing. So when the wondering reached Prudence Hallett, she did not start it, but she gave it a home, and she watered it, and she carried it to the well and the chapel and the store counter, and she was the one who, when Della came into the store that week to buy flour and coffee and nails for the fence, went quiet and stiff, and served her with a face like a closed door, and short-weighted her on the flour, just a little, just enough, and did not meet her eyes. Della felt it. Della had a lifetime of feeling exactly that. She paid for the short-weighted flour, and she said thank you in her plain, even voice, and she carried it out to the wagon, and she did not let her face do anything at all. Because she had learned young that letting them see it land was the one thing you must never do. And she drove back down to the landing with the short flour and the quiet in her chest. And that night she did not eat much supper, and Amos noticed, and did not know why, and did not ask, because he did not yet know how to ask her things. But the dog knew. The dog put its heavy head in her lap that night while she sat by the stove, and leaned its weight into her the way it had that first day in the rain. And Della sat with her hand on the rough, gray fur, and looked into the fire and let herself feel, for just a minute, in the dark, with only the dog to see it, the old, bottomless tiredness of being a thing that towns wondered about. She had felt it in the town on the dry side of the mountains. She had felt it in the town before that. She had felt it, God help her, in her own marriage, from a man who had married her because she was strong and useful, and would not expect to be wanted. A man who had needed her hands and her back and her steadiness, and had never once in 11 years looked at her the way Amos Colter had looked at her on the landing dock. And she had told herself for 11 years that being needed was enough, that being needed was a kind of love if you squinted, and she had almost believed it. And then he had died, and she had discovered that a woman who has only ever been needed is, at the moment the need ends, precisely as alone as if she had never been anything at all. That was Della Rourke's true wound, the one underneath the size of her and the towns and the wondering. It was not that people were unkind to her body. She had made a hard peace with that a long time ago. It was that in 39 years of being useful, of being strong, of being the one who got up in the dark and loaded the wagon alone, no one had ever wanted her. They had wanted what she could do. There is a difference between those two things as wide as a river. And Della Rourke had spent her whole life on the far bank of it, watching other people be wanted, and telling herself she didn't mind. She minded. Sitting by Amos Colter's stove with his dog's head in her lap and the short-weighted flour in the pantry, and the whole town wondering about her, Della Rourke let herself know, for 1 minute, exactly how much she minded. And then she folded it up small and put it away, the way she put everything away. And she got up and banked the fire and climbed to her dry loft over the tack room. And she slept, because tomorrow the wagon needed loading, and the loading did not care what she minded. Winter came down out of the mountains, and the work got harder. And that was almost a mercy, because hard work was the one thing in the world Della Rourke had never had to wonder whether she was worthy of. The river ran high with the first snow melt and rain, and the raft crews ran lumber day and night to get it out before the deep freeze locked the landing. And Della and Amos hauled from dark to dark, 4 loads some days, 5 when the light allowed, down the killing grade that had grown treacherous with ice at the washed edge. And here is a thing I want you to see clearly, because it is the heart of what was happening between them, slow, under the surface, while the town wondered and Renfrew waited. They had become, without either of them deciding it, a single working thing. She loaded, he stacked. He drove up, she drove down. She knew before he said it when the black was favoring a hoof, and he knew before she said it when the ice on the grade had gotten bad enough to chain up. They passed tools without asking. They ate without talking. When the near rear wheel cracked its iron tire on a frozen rut 3 miles up the grade with a full load and dark coming, they did not panic, and they did not argue. She chalked the wheels and unhitched the team, and he built a fire, and they worked the cold iron and the split fellow together in the firelight for 2 hours until it would roll. And they got the load down in the black dark by lantern, and at the bottom Amos said, "Huh," and Della said, "Huh," back, dry, mocking him gently, and Amos Colter laughed. It was a short laugh, and rusty, like a hinge that hasn't moved in years, and it seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her, and he shut it off fast and looked almost guilty, the way the grieving do the first time joy sneaks past their guard. But it had happened. She had made Amos Colter laugh, in the frozen dark, over a cracked wheel, and neither of them ever forgot it. And it became, without their saying so, the moment each of them privately marked as the one where the thing between them stopped being work and started being something with no name they'd allow themselves to use. The bond between 2 wounded people is a careful architecture, and I want to slow down here and let you watch it get built. Because our world is full of stories about love that arrives like lightning. And this was not that. This was love that arrived like water, finding its way down through 100 small cracks over 100 cold days, patient. And once it had found its channel, impossible to send back uphill. It was built out of small things. It was built out of Amos noticing, one bitter morning, that Della's canvas coat had worn through at the shoulder from throwing lumber, and saying nothing, and then that Saturday there being a new heavy wool coat hung on the peg by the door, cut generous, cut in her size, which was not a size the store carried, which meant he had gone to the woman who sewed in town and told her the measurements, which meant he had paid attention to the breadth of Della Rourke's shoulders closely enough to describe them to a seamstress. And Della had stood looking at that coat on the peg for a long time before she put it on. And when she put it on, it fit. It fit the way nothing had fit her in years, and she had to go out to the corral and stand with her face against the black horse's warm neck for a while, before she could come back in, and I, in her plain, even voice, "Coat fits." And Amos, at the stove, not turning around, had said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. Coat fits, good. And it contained more than most people say to each other in a year. I need to tell you now about the thing that had happened to Amos Colter, because Della learned it that winter, and because you cannot understand the choosing at the end of this story until you understand the grief at the middle of it. It came out slow, the way everything with Amos came out. At the table one night when the wind was up and the stove was warm and the dog was asleep, and a bad memory had put a stillness on him that even Della couldn't work around. She did not ask. She never asked. She just sat and mended a harness by the lamp and made herself easy to talk to by not requiring it. And after a long time, Amos Colter told her. He'd had a wife. Her name was Ruth. And they'd had a little boy of 6 named Samuel. And 4 winters back, the diphtheria had come up the river the way it did in those days, town to town. And it had taken the boy in 3 days, quick and cruel. And Ruth had nursed him to the end. And then Ruth had gotten it herself, from the nursing. And she had followed her son inside a week. And Amos Colter had buried the 2 people he loved in the frozen ground of the same January, and come back to a house that had been full and was now a box of echoes. And he had not, he said, quite figured out since then what a man was supposed to do with himself in a house like that. He told it flat, staring at the lamp, in the plain, worn-out voice of a man who has told himself the facts of the thing so many times that the facts have gone smooth as river stones. And Della listened, and did not reach for him, and did not say she was sorry, because she knew, she of all people knew, that I'm sorry was a door people said to close a subject, not to open it. Instead, when he was done, when the wind had filled a long silence, she said the thing that no one in 4 years had said to Amos Colter. The true thing, the hard thing. She said, "You kept the horses." Amos looked at her. "What?" "After," she said, "you lost everything. And you kept the horses fed and brushed and their feet trimmed. 4 years, even when you stopped keeping the fences, even when you stopped keeping yourself. A man who wanted to die doesn't keep 4 horses alive through 4 winters. That's not grief holding on. That's you holding on, underneath it, whether you meant to or not." She set down the harness. "You've been telling yourself for 4 years you don't know what a man's supposed to do in a house like this. But your hands knew. Your hands got up every morning and fed the horses. Your hands never once stopped choosing to keep something alive." Amos Colter put his face in his hands then, at his own kitchen table, and his shoulders shook and he wept, the deep, silent, racking weeping of a man who has not let himself weep in years, 4 years of it coming up at once. And Della Rourke did not touch him, and did not hush him, and did not tell him it would be all right. She got up, quiet, and she put the kettle on, and she stood at the stove with her back to him, giving him the same gift he had given her that first night in the doorway. The gift of grieving in a warm room with another soul present who would not make him perform it, or apologize for it, or hurry it along. And when it had passed, when he had gone quiet and wiped his face on his sleeve, she poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. And she sat back down and picked up the harness. And after a while, Amos said, in a wrecked and steadier voice, "Nobody ever said that to me, about the horses." "It was true," Della said. "That's all I know how to say. True things." She threaded the awl. "Sometimes true is the only comfort there is, and it's a cold one, but it's the only kind that doesn't wear off." Outside, the wind worked at the corners of the house, and the river ran black and cold under the ice at its edges. And inside, 2 people sat at a table that had once been full and was learning, slow, to be full in a different way. And neither of them said the thing that both of them were beginning to know, which was that the house did not echo tonight the way it had echoed for 4 years, and that the difference was sitting across the table threading an awl by lamplight, and that Amos Colter, who had buried the 2 people he loved and told himself he was done with wanting anything, had begun, against his own will and his own grief and his own careful guarding, to want. Christmas came to Slater's Bend, and with it the first hard test of what the town's wondering had built. And it came, as these things do, at the one time of year when a person's belonging is measured most cruelly, which is the moment everyone else has somewhere to be. The half-built chapel held a service and a supper, the whole valley's one great gathering of the year, and it was understood, in the unspoken way these things are understood, that everyone came. Amos had not gone in 4 years, but that year, for reasons he did not examine too closely, he cleaned his good coat, and he told Della they were going. And Della looked at him a long moment, and understood that it cost him something to walk back into that chapel, where he had last sat between a wife and a son, and understood, too, that he was choosing to pay it. And she put on the wool coat he'd had made for her, and she went. They walked in together, and the chapel went quiet. Not silent, exactly, just a small drop in the sound, a hitch, the sound a room makes when it has been talking about the people who just walked in. Amos felt it, and his jaw went tight. Della felt it, and her face went smooth and level, and gave them nothing. And she found them a place on a back bench, and they sat, and the wondering wrapped around them in that warm, crowded room, like a cold draught that everyone could feel and no one would name. Prudence Hallett sat 3 benches up, with her husband and her 2 clean children, and she did not turn around, but Della watched the back of her neck go stiff, and knew she was aware of them every second, and knew that after the service the wondering would have new fuel, that they came to the chapel bold as you please, the 2 of them, sitting together like man and wife, and no shame in them at all. And Della sat through the singing and the reading and felt the old familiar thing, the thing she had felt in every town, the being among people and utterly outside them. And she bore it the way she bore everything, straight-backed, until the moment that changed it. It was Renfrew who changed it, and he did it, of course, with a kindness. That was his genius. After the service, at the supper, with the whole valley milling and eating in the lamp-lit chapel, Silas Renfrew crossed the room in his clean coat and came to where Amos and Della stood a little apart at the edge of it. And he smiled his soft, precise smile, and he said, loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear, loud enough that it would travel, "Colter, good to see you back among decent folk, and your hired girl." He let the pause do the work. Hired girl. A woman of 39, and the word girl, and the pause before it that turned the whole thing filthy, and the 2 words hired and girl set side by side in a way that told everyone within earshot exactly what he wanted them to imagine she was hired for. It was masterful. It was vicious. And it was completely deniable, because on its face he had only greeted them kindly and named her position, and if Amos took offense, then Amos was the crude-minded one, reading filth into an innocent Christmas greeting. Amos went white and then red, and Della saw his hand close, and she saw the whole thing about to go wrong, saw Amos about to strike a rich man in the chapel on Christmas and hand Renfrew everything he wanted, and she did the only thing that could stop it. She put her hand on Amos's arm, just that, steady, and she stepped forward, and she looked Silas Renfrew full in his soft, pale face, and she said, in her plain, even, carrying voice, without heat, so that the whole listening room could hear every calm word, "I'm his hauler, Mr. Renfrew. I load and drive 4 ton of green lumber down your killing grade 6 days a week, which is work I notice you can't get any of your own men to do for Colter at any wage, on account of you told them not to. And I've been doing it since October without a wreck, which is more than the last 2 men could say, one of whom you'll recall is at the bottom of the river." The chapel had gone truly silent now, the way a room goes when something real is happening in it, and Della Rourke was not finished. She kept her voice even and low, and pitched it to Carrie, And she went on, looking only at Renfrew, treating the 50 listening people as though they were not there, which was the thing that made them lean in to hear. "You called me a hired girl just now," she said, with a little stop in the middle, "so these good people would think something ugly. That's all right. I've been called worse, by better." A few people drew breath at that. "But I want to say a true thing back to you, in front of everybody, since we're being social." She let it sit one beat. "You've been trying to starve Amos Colter off his landing for a year, raised his fees, slowed his loading, and when that didn't work, because I get up in the dark and load the wagon myself before your men are out of bed, you started a whisper about the two of us, to shame him out of what your money couldn't buy him out of. That's not a Christmas greeting, Mr. Renfrew. That's a rich man who's found out he can't beat a broke widower and a fat woman at honest hauling, so he's trying to beat them at gossip instead." The word fell into the silent chapel like a dropped stone. Fat woman. She said it herself, flat, without flinching, the word the whole town had been using behind her back for 2 months, and by saying it plainly, in her own strong, steady voice, she took it out of their hands. She made it just a word. She made it just a true fact about her body, no more shameful than the color of the black horse, and in doing so, she did something the town had never seen a person her size do, which was refuse to be ashamed. And Silas Renfrew, who had built his whole power on the shame of others, felt for one instant the ground move under him, and his soft smile flickered. "That's a great deal of imagination," Renfrew said, recovering, his voice still smooth. "For a woman who drives a wagon." "It might be," Della agreed pleasantly. "I'm just a hauler. I could have it all wrong. Easiest thing in the world to find out, though. Open your loading books to the town. Show everybody the fees, before October and after. Show them whose loads got run slow and whose got run fast. It's all just numbers in a book. Numbers don't lie, same as wood." She smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It was a smile with a long, cold edge on it. "Unless there's something in the book you'd rather these good folks didn't see." Now, Silas Renfrew was far too clever to answer that, and he didn't. He gave a small, dismissive laugh and a shake of his head, the picture of a reasonable man declining to argue with a hysteric, and he said something gracious and empty about the season, and he withdrew, unhurried, back into the crowd, and to 9 out of 10 people in that chapel, he had won the exchange by refusing to have it. But there is always a 10th person, and in that chapel, the 10th person was old Ott Klein, who had sawed timber in that valley for 40 years, who owed Renfrew nothing and feared him less. A gnarled and salted old man who had been standing near enough to hear all of it, with a tin cup of cider in his fist. And into the polished silence that Renfrew left behind him, Ott Klein said to nobody and everybody, in a voice like a saw going through a knot, "She's right, you know." Heads turned. Ott took a slow pull of his cider. "Fees went up in October. My boy hauls for the Dunmore outfit, seen the notice. And I've been up to that yard. Colter's wagon sits in hours some mornings while Boyd loads everybody else. Everybody's seen it. Difference is, that woman there just said it out loud." He looked around the chapel, at all the faces that had spent 2 months wondering. "I don't know nothing about what goes on down at the landing, and neither do none of you, and a man ought to be ashamed to guess. But I know a slow load when I see one, and I know a fee notice when I read one, and I know that woman does more work in a morning than Boyd does in a week. That much ain't gossip. That much I seen with my own eyes." And then Ott Klein, having said more words at once than anyone present had heard him say in a decade, went red at his own speech and clamped his mouth shut, and went back to his cider. And the chapel was left holding what he'd said, which was not much, which was only an old man vouching for what he'd seen. And yet, it was the first crack in the thing, the first place where the waters started to run the other way, because Ott Klein did not lie, and everybody knew it. And if Ott Klein said the slow loads were real, then maybe the rest of the wondering was worth wondering about after all. Della Rourke did not press it. She had learned that too, long ago, when to stop. She took Amos's arm, gently, and she said, quiet now, just to him, "Let's go home." And they walked out of that chapel together into the Christmas cold. And behind them the room erupted into the low, urgent buzz of a town rearranging what it thought it knew. And Amos, in the snow outside, stopped and looked at her. And there was something in his face that had not been there in 4 years, which was pride. Not in himself, in her. "Nobody ever stood up for me in there," he said. "You didn't stand up for me," Della said. "I stood up for the truth. You just happened to be standing next to it." But she said it with the corner of her mouth turned, and Amos saw the turn. And in the snow and the lamplight leaking from the chapel windows, the two of them almost smiled at each other. And then the dog came bounding up out of the dark to walk them home, and the moment turned and went on. The winter deepened, and something in the town had shifted, small but real, the way a river shifts a single stone and slowly, over a season, changes its whole course. Ott Klein started coming down to the landing. He said it was to watch the raft crews, but he came on days there were no raft crews, and he'd stand at the edge of the yard with his hands in his coat and watch Della load and stack, and offer a single word of advice now and again. "Canter," or "Short course there." And Della would do it, and it would be right, and Ott would grunt. And slowly the two of them built the particular friendship of people who trust competence more than they trust talk. Then one bitter morning, Ott showed up before dawn, when Della was loading alone by lantern in the dark. And without a word, the old man picked up the other end of a plank, and they loaded the wagon together. And after that, Ott was there most mornings, an old sawyer with nothing to prove, helping a woman half the town still wondered about, because he had decided she was worth helping. And Ott Klein's decisions moved other men. A young hand named Pete, 17, who worked at the mill and had laughed with Boyd back in October, started finding reasons to be down at the landing, and then to lend a hand, and then to work an unpaid hour before his mill shift just to learn from Della how she stacked a load so it rode. Because Pete wanted to be a teamster someday, and had figured out that the fat woman the town wondered about was simply the best hauler in the valley, and that being the best at a hard thing was its own kind of authority that no wondering could touch. This is how it goes, in the world and in this story both. Worth proven with the hands, day after day, in front of witnesses, wears down the wondering the way water wears down stone. Not fast, not all at once, but past all stopping. The town did not fall in love with Della Rourke that winter, but it began, grudgingly, in the persons of Ott and Pete and a few others, to respect her. And respect is a harder currency than affection, and it spends further. Renfrew felt the shift, of course. He felt it the way a spider feels the change in the web. He had counted on the town's shame doing his work for him, and the town's shame was leaking away. And worse, the woman had made him look, for one moment in the chapel, like exactly what he was. And Silas Renfrew could forgive a great many things, but he could not forgive being made to look small in front of the valley. He stopped being patient. That was his mistake, and it is the mistake his kind always eventually make. because patience is only a virtue in service of something, and Renfrew's patience had only ever been in service of his pride, and wounded pride cannot wait. So Renfrew reached for the law. He had a lawyer, a soft, grubbing man named Atwater, who came up on the winter stage, and Atwater began to look into the Colter landing rights, the old grant that gave Amos the exclusive right to raft lumber off that low stretch of river. And Atwater found, or claimed to find, a flaw. The grant, he said, required the holder to maintain the landing to a certain standard, and to run a certain minimum of timber through it each year to keep it active. And Colter, in his years of grief, had let the paperwork lapse and the volume fall. And so the grant, Atwater argued, had reverted, or could be made to revert. And Renfrew's outfit stood ready to claim the rights the moment they did. And Renfrew filed a petition with the Territorial Land Office to have the Colter grant declared lapsed and reassigned. And he had it timed, the patient part of him still working even inside his impatience, to be heard at the land office session in the county seat in the early spring, right at the moment when the ice broke and the river ran, and the whole year's hauling had to happen, so that Amos would be fighting for his rights in a courtroom exactly when he most needed to be running lumber, and would lose either the case or the season, or both. Amos got the notice in February. He read it at the kitchen table by lamplight twice, and then he set it down, and his face did the thing Della had learned to dread. The going still, the old grief stillness reaching up to claim him, the part of him that had spent 4 years believing that everything he touched was taken from him. And here at last was the proof. "That's it then," he said, quiet. "He's found the way. I let the volume drop those years after Ruth. He's right, that's the plain truth of it. I let it all lapse. The grant's probably gone." He looked at his hands on the table. "Maybe it's for the best. Man can't hold what he can't hold." And Della Rourke looked at Amos Colter across that table, at the grief rising up to swallow him, at the water about to be let back uphill. And she felt something in her own chest that she had not felt in a very long time, something hotter than her usual patience. And it took her a moment to recognize it, because it had been so long. It was fight, real fight, the kind she'd only ever spent on her own survival, rising up now on behalf of somebody else. And she understood, in that moment, with the notice on the table between them, that Amos Colter had stopped being her employer and had become the thing she was not going to let the world take without a fight, and that this fierce, unfamiliar refusal was closer to love than anything her needful marriage had ever taught her the word could hold. "No," Della said. Amos looked up. "No what?" "No, it's not for the best, and no, we're not giving it to him." She stood up. She was a large woman, and when she stood in that small kitchen, she filled it. And for once, she did not make herself smaller. She let herself be exactly as big as she was. "You listen to me, Amos Colter, and then you can argue if you've got a true argument. But you'll not sit at this table and hand a good thing to a bad man because grief told you you deserve to lose it." Amos said nothing, which, with Amos, meant keep going. "That petition says the grant lapses if you don't maintain the landing and run a minimum of timber. Fine. When does it get heard?" "Land office, county seat, first week of April." "And what have we been doing all winter?" "Della, what have we been doing?" she said again, quiet now, leaning her fists on the table. "Every single day since October, in the cold, in the dark, down that killing grade." And Amos, slow, began to see it. "Running timber," he said. "Running timber," Della said.
More timber off that landing than's gone off it in 3 years. You've been maintaining the landing and running the volume all winter without even knowing it was the thing that'd save you. Because I was too stubborn to load slow, and you were too proud to run less. If that grant lapses for low volume, then we've got a book full of raft manifests that says it didn't lapse at all, that says the landing's more active this winter than it's been since before Ruth. The petition's built on old numbers. Renfrew's fighting the man you were 2 years ago. He doesn't know the man you are now, because he can't imagine anybody down here working as hard as we've been working, because nobody works that hard for him. Amos Colter sat very still, and Della watched the thing happen in his face that she had been waiting all winter to see. The grief stillness cracking, and underneath it, coming up like the black horse's breath in the cold, the thing she'd told him about on the landing dock in October. The thing you find out you're made of about the time everything's coming down. He was made of the kind that holds. He'd just needed someone to stack the load low enough that he could feel it ride. "We'd need the manifests," Amos said slowly, the teamster in him waking up, calculating. "Every raft that's gone out. Crew signatures, board feet, dates. The raft bosses keep tallies, but they don't always." "Then we get every tally from every raft boss between here and the coast," Della said. "And we get Ott to swear to the volume, because Ott's watched us load all winter, and the whole valley trusts Ott. And we get the fee notices Renfrew posted, which prove he was raising your costs at the same time he's claiming you abandoned the landing, which a land officer might find interesting. A man trying to force a lapse while charging more to prevent it." She straightened up. "You didn't let it lapse, Amos. You've spent all winter saving it and grieving too hard to notice. That's the truth. And you told me yourself, true is the only thing I know how to say. So we're going to go into that land office, and we're going to say a true thing so plainly that all his soft, clever lying can't stand up next to it." Amos looked at her for a long moment. The lamp burned. The dog thumped its tail once against the floor as if to vote. And then Amos Colter did a thing he had not done since Ruth died, which was reach across a table and take another person's hand. And he took Della Rourke's big, scarred hand in his 2 rough ones, and he held it. And he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than the thing itself. And Della, who had been touched 1,000 times in her life the way you touch a tool, the way you grip a strong thing to use it, sat very still and let herself be touched. For the first time she could remember, the way you touch a person you do not want to lose. And that is the difference, isn't it? The difference this whole story turns on. The difference between being gripped like a tool and being held like a treasure. And Della Rourke was 39 years old before she felt the second kind, at a kitchen table in the timber country, with a land office fight ahead of her and a bad man's whole fortune arrayed against a book of raft tallies and the truth. And she would have taken that fight and worse, 10 times worse, to keep feeling her hand held exactly like that. "All right," Amos said finally, letting her hand go, gruff, wiping at his eye with the heel of his palm and pretending he wasn't. "All right. We fight it." "We fight it," Della said. And outside, the wind had dropped, and the first thaw was still weeks off, but something had thawed already in that kitchen. And the 2 of them sat up late into the night by the lamp, the notice pushed aside, and made their plans. An old grieving teamster and the woman his dog had forgiven, plotting how to beat a rich man with nothing but the plain record of their own hard winter's work. They spent February and March building their case the way they built everything, with their hands, in the cold, without complaint. Amos wrote to every raft boss on the river,
and where writing wouldn't reach them, Della drove to them, taking the wagon down the frozen roads to the crew camps and the coast towns, sitting in cold bunkhouses while suspicious rivermen dug out their tally books and copied out the board feet and the dates and signed their names. And slowly the manifests came together, a thick sheaf of them, a paper record of every raft that had left the Colter landing since October, and the number at the bottom, when Amos added it, was more than double the minimum the grant required. And he sat and looked at that number for a long while, because it was proof, in ink, that he had not failed, that even at his lowest, grieving, half alive, he had been holding. And there is a particular healing in being handed proof of your own strength when you had convinced yourself you had none. Ott Klein agreed to testify, though he grumbled about the county seat and the stiff collar he'd have to wear. Pete offered too, Ernest and 17, and they told him to stay and mind the horses, and he was crushed. And Della took him aside and told him minding the horses through the land office week was the most important job there was, which was half a kindness and half the truth. And Pete stood 2 inches taller and minded the horses like they were made of gold. And Della, quietly, without telling Amos, did one more thing. She went to see Prudence Hallett. She walked into the store on a gray afternoon when she knew Hallett's husband was up at the mill and Prudence was alone at the counter. And Prudence went stiff the way she always did, and Della set down no money and asked for no flour. She just stood across the counter from the woman who had short-weighted her and carried the wondering to the well. And she said, plainly, "I didn't come to fight with you. I came to ask you something, and then I'll go." Prudence said nothing, wary. "You keep the store books," Della said. "You'd have record of what Renfrew's mill charged for goods this winter, and when the prices moved. And you'd remember because you don't miss much when the talk about me and Amos started, and where you first heard it." She paused. "I think you first heard it from Renfrew, or from his man Atwater, or from somebody close to him. I think it came down from the top, and you carried it because you were told it, not because you saw it. And I'm not here to shame you for that. Lord knows I've carried things I was told." Something crossed Prudence Hallett's face at that, something that might have been the beginning of shame, the real kind, the useful kind. "What I want to ask you," Della said, "is whether, if a land officer were to ask you under oath where that talk started, you'd tell him the truth. That's all. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking whether you're the kind that tells the truth when it's asked of you plainly. I think you might be. I think that's why you can't quite look at me, because some part of you has known for a while now that you carried water for a liar." And Della Rourke picked up nothing and paid for nothing, and turned and walked out of that store, and left Prudence Hallett standing at her counter with 2 months of small, quiet cruelty sitting in her chest. And she did not know, walking out, whether she'd reached the woman or hardened her, because you never do know. That's the thing about planting truth in a person. You plant it, and you walk away, and you don't get to watch whether it takes. But here is what I will tell you, because I want you to carry it with you the way Della carried her few kindnesses, small and careful. It is never too late for a person to become the kind that tells the truth. The whole of Prudence Hallett's life had built her into a frightened woman who fit herself into a small, tight shape and punished those who wouldn't. And a large, plain woman had stood at her counter and offered her, without anger, a door out of that smallness, and had trusted her enough to be worth the truth. And whether Prudence Hallett would walk through that door was, as the first thaw finally broke over the timber country and the river began to groan and shift under its ice, the one loose thread in Della's whole careful case, the one thing she could not load square with her own 2 hands, the one thing she had to leave to another soul's freedom. The thaw came hard that year. The river broke its ice in the last week of March with a sound like the world cracking open, and the water came up brown and violent and full of the winter's snow, and the whole valley turned its face to the season's work. And into that quickening, into the mud and the meltwater, and the shriek of the mill starting its hardest run of the year, Amos Colter and Della Rourke loaded the wagon one last time before the land office session, and left Pete and the dog to mind the landing, and set out for the county seat with a sheaf of manifests wrapped in oilcloth against the rain, to go and say a true thing in a room full of a rich man's lies. The county seat was 2 days off by wagon, a real town with a brick courthouse and a land office and streets that had names, and Della and Amos came into it muddy and tired, and slept in a cheap room over a livery, in 2 narrow beds, and lay awake in the dark, not talking, each of them listening to the other not sleep, each of them turning over the fight ahead. In the black quiet, Amos said, once, low, "Whatever happens tomorrow." "Yeah. You did more for me than—" And he stopped, the sentence too large to finish, the old Colter way, and Della lay in the dark and let the unfinished thing hang there, and filled it in herself with all the words he couldn't reach. And she said, into the dark, "I know. Go to sleep, Amos." And he did, or pretended to, and she lay awake a while longer, listening to his breathing even out, and she thought about how strange it was to have crossed a whole valley and half a winter to find herself lying awake in a livery loft, caring more about another person's tomorrow than her own. And she thought that if she lost everything the next day, if the land office ruled against them, and Renfrew took the landing, and it all went under, she would still have had this caring, and that even the having of it was more than the town on the dry side of the mountains had ever let her believe she'd get. The hearing was at 10, in a plain room in the land office, before a territorial land commissioner named Judge Harlan Voss, a heavy, tired old man with spectacles and 40 years of listening to people lie about land in his face, which had made him, as it makes some men, either very cynical or very good at hearing the truth. And Slater's Bend would find out that morning which. Renfrew was there in a fine coat, with his lawyer Atwater beside him, and Atwater had a leather case of papers and the confident, soft manner of a man who has done this many times and won. And when Amos and Della came in with their oilcloth bundle, Renfrew looked at them and gave them his small, precise nod, courteous, certain, a man greeting the people he has already beaten. Atwater laid out the petition first, and he was good, I'll give him that. He was smooth and organized, and he made it sound like the simplest thing in the world. That the Colter grant required maintenance and minimum volume. That Colter, in his well-known troubles, had let both lapse for years. That the public interest was best served by reassigning the rights to an outfit, meaning Renfrew's, that could actually use them. And he laid down old records, the volume tallies from 2 and 3 years back, when Amos had been at the bottom of his grief and barely running any timber at all. And the numbers were low, shamefully low. And Atwater read them out one by one, and let them sit. And Judge Voss looked at them over his spectacles, and his heavy face gave away nothing. Then it was Amos's turn, and here is the thing I have to tell you, because it nearly went wrong. Amos stood up to speak, and the grief stillness came over him, in that official room, under that rich man's certain gaze, and the words would not come. He had never been a talker. He stood there with the manifests in his hands, and 4 years of being beaten down told him he would lose. And he opened his mouth, and what came out was small and halting. "I run more now than them numbers say. And Atwater smoothly interrupted, "Your Honor,
The current season has barely begun. We can hardly credit—" And Amos faltered, and Renfrew allowed himself the smallest curve of his mouth. And Della Rourke saw the whole thing about to be lost to a good man's inability to speak for himself in a room built to silence him. So she stood up. A large woman standing up in a small official room draws every eye, and it drew Judge Voss's. And she said, before Atwater could object, in her plain, even, carrying voice, "Your Honor, I'm the hauler. I drove every one of those rafts worth of lumber down to that landing myself this winter. I expect the numbers ought to be spoken to by the person who actually moved them, if the court will hear me." Judge Harlan Voss looked at Della Rourke over his spectacles for a long moment. This large, plain woman in a work coat, standing up uninvited in his hearing room. And then he did a thing that decided everything, though no one knew it yet. He said, "Set down, Mr. Colter. I'll hear the hauler." And Atwater started to object, and the judge said, mild, without looking at him, "It's my hearing, counselor."
"Set down yourself." And Silas Renfrew's certain little smile went stiff at the corners, because a patient man reads rooms, and he had just read something in the tired old judge that he did not like, which was curiosity. And curiosity is the one thing a liar cannot control. And Della Rourke, given the floor, did not orate, because she had no gift for it and knew it. She did what she did with wood and with horses and with grief. She told the plain truth plainly, and she anchored every word of it to something you could hold in your hand. She unwrapped the oilcloth, and she laid the manifests on the table, and she said, "These are the raft tallies off the Colter landing since October. Every one signed by the raft boss that took it out. Dates, board feet, crew. I collected most of them myself, drove to the coast camps to get the ones the mail wouldn't reach." She squared the stack. "Mr. Atwater read you numbers from 2 years back and 3 years back, and those numbers are true, Your Honor. I won't say they aren't. Amos Colter buried his wife and his boy in 1 January, and for a couple of years after that he barely ran timber at all. Because a man that's lost his whole family sometimes can barely run himself. That's in these old numbers, and it's true. And it's the saddest arithmetic I ever saw." She let that sit. The room was quiet. "But Mr. Atwater stopped reading it last year, Your Honor, and I'd respectfully ask why, because the answer's in this stack. This winter, October to now, off that same landing, we ran—" and she gave the number, the big number, the doubled number. "Board feet, which is more than the grant's minimum twice over, and more than's gone off that landing in 3 years, and every foot of it's signed for right here. So the grant hasn't lapsed for low volume. It's the busiest it's been since before the man's family died. Mr. Renfrew's petition is built on the numbers from when Amos Colter was drowning in grief, and it stops right at the line where he started climbing out. And I'd guess that's not an accident, because Mr. Renfrew knows exactly how much we ran this winter. He knows because we ran every foot of it off his mill's chute, and he's got the loading records to prove it. And I'd invite the court to ask him for those records, which will match these manifests to the board foot." Judge Voss looked at Renfrew. "That's so, Mr. Renfrew? You've loading records that'd confirm these volumes?" And Renfrew, cornered, did the only thing he could. He smiled and spread his soft hands and said the records were voluminous and would take time to compile. And the judge grunted, which out of a judge is a cousin to Amos's and made a note. And Della pressed on, because she had learned from wood that you drive the wedge while the crack is open. "There's one more thing, Your Honor, and then I'll set down. Mr. Atwater says the grant requires the landing be maintained. Well, Mr. Renfrew's been maintaining a hardship on it. Here's the fee notices his mill posted this winter." And she laid them down, the notices, in Renfrew's own mill's hand. He raised Colter's loading fees 3 times since October, right while he was preparing this petition that says Colter abandoned the landing. Now, I'm just a hauler, Your Honor. I don't know the law. But it seems a strange thing for a man to argue that another man abandoned a business, at the very same time he's charging that man more and more to keep running it. It's like a man arguing the well's gone dry while he's the one been charging you to haul the water. Both those things can't be true. Either Colter abandoned the landing, in which case, why raise his fees? Or Colter was running it hard enough to be worth squeezing, in which case it wasn't abandoned. Mr. Renfrew's petition needs it to be dry, and his fee notices need it to be running. I'll let the court decide which of his 2 stories to believe, since he can't have both. There was a silence in that hearing room, and it was the particular silence of a well-laid argument settling into place, and Judge Harlan Voss leaned back in his chair and took off his spectacles and rubbed the deep, tired grooves at the sides of his nose and looked at Della Rourke for a good while. "You said you don't know the law," the judge said.
"No, sir. I know wood and horses."
Said Judge Voss. "Well, you've got a better nose for a contradiction than half the lawyers that stand in this room, and they went to school for it." He put his spectacles back on. And Atwater, sweating a little now, launched into a long, smooth recovery, arguing that the fees were a separate commercial matter, that the volume this season was unverified, that the court should not be swayed by a hauler's dramatics. And he was good, and he talked for a long time, and the tide of the thing began, slowly, under all that smooth lawyer's talk, to slide back toward Renfrew. Because that is the terrible power of a skilled liar in a room. They can make the truth sound like just one more opinion. They can bury a plain fact under an hour of reasonable-sounding doubt, and Della felt it sliding and did not know how to stop it, because she had said her true things, and the true things were all said, and Atwater was drowning them in words. And it was at that moment, at the low point, with the case slipping, that the door at the back of the hearing room opened, and everyone turned, and in came a woman in a good gray dress, out of breath, having come the 2 days from Slater's Bend by the stage, clutching a ledger to her chest. It was Prudence Hallett. Della's breath caught. Amos looked at her, not understanding, and Prudence Hallett stood in the doorway of that official room, pale and frightened, and having clearly not slept, a respectable woman who had never in her life done a single thing that wasn't small and safe and expected of her. And she looked at Judge Voss, and she said, in a voice that shook and then steadied,
"Your Honor, I'm sorry to come in late. My name is Prudence Hallett. I keep the store at Slater's Bend, and I heard there was a hearing about the Colter landing, and I've got something I need to say. And if I don't say it, I don't think I'll ever sleep right again."
Judge Voss, who had seen many things in 40 years, but perhaps not often this, waved her forward. And Prudence Hallett came down the aisle past Renfrew, and she would not look at Renfrew, and she set her store ledger on the table next to Della's manifests, and she said the thing she had come 2 days to say.
"This winter," she said, "there was talk in our town about Mr. Colter and the woman he hired. Ugly talk, about the 2 of them living out at the landing, and I carried that talk, Your Honor. I'm ashamed to say it, but I carried it further than most. And I want the court to know where it started, because I've been asking myself all winter why I believed it. And the answer is that I didn't come up with it. It was given to me. It was Mr. Atwater there, in my own store in November, who first said it to me. Real quiet, real concerned. Said, wasn't it a shame about Colter's judgment since his loss? Said a thing about the woman that I won't repeat. And I took it, and I ran with it, God forgive me. And so did half the town. And it was all to shame Mr. Colter off his land." She was crying now, but her voice held. "And here's my ledger, Your Honor. Because Mrs. Rourke asked me a true question, and I couldn't answer it, and then I couldn't stop thinking about it."
Renfrew's mill raised the prices on everything in my store this winter, same as he raised Colter's fees. And it's all in this book with the dates, and the dates line up with the petition. And I think he was squeezing the whole town while he got ready to say Colter quit. And I'd rather tell the truth and be poorer for it than keep carrying his lies and call myself a decent woman. And Prudence Hallett sat down, right there on the front bench, shaking, spent, having done the single bravest thing of her whole small, careful life. And Della Rourke looked at her and felt her throat close, because she had planted the truth in that woman and walked away not knowing if it would take. And here it had taken. Here it had grown 2 days overnight on a cold stage road, and it had come into this room, and it had turned the tide. You could feel it turn. You could feel the whole weight of the thing swing back. Because a hauler's manifests were one matter, but a respectable storekeeper's wife weeping her own shame and naming Renfrew's lawyer to a judge's face was a thing no amount of smooth talk could bury. Atwater was on his feet, protesting, and his voice had gone up half an octave, and that told everyone in the room more than his words did. Because Atwater had been smooth for 2 hours, and now Atwater was shrill. And Judge Voss looked at the shrill lawyer, and looked at the weeping storekeeper's wife and her ledger, and looked at the sheaf of signed manifests, and looked, last and longest, at Silas Renfrew, who had gone very still and very pale in his fine coat. And that is when Silas Renfrew made the mistake that finished him. The mistake his kind always make, the contemptuous slip. Because a patient man can hold his temper for a year, but not forever. And Renfrew had just watched a fat hauler and a storewoman undo in one morning what he'd spent a year and a fortune building. And something in him could not bear it. And it came out of him before he could stop it. "This is absurd," Renfrew said. And he stood. And for the first time in the whole hearing his soft, even voice had an edge on it. A curl of the real thing underneath. The contempt he'd kept so carefully varnished for so long. "Your Honor, are we truly going to decide the disposition of valuable timber rights on the word of a hysterical shopkeeper's wife and—" And here it came. Here was the slip. Here was the thing that lived under all his patience finally showing its face. And a fat, drifting nobody of a woman who wandered into that town off the road with everything she owned on her back. Look at her. Colter's operation is a joke. It's a grieving man and a great ox of a female playing at freight. And this court's time is worth more than their theatrics. And the room went dead silent. Because he had said it. He had finally said out loud in front of a judge the thing he truly thought. The contempt that had driven the whole scheme. And it hung in the air of that official room, ugly and naked. A great ox of a female. A fat, drifting nobody. And everyone in the room heard not an argument, but a cruelty. And Judge Harlan Voss took off his spectacles very slowly. Della Rourke did not flinch. She had heard every one of those words before, all of them, worse. And she stood there and took them the way she'd taken the load coming down off the wagon on the hill, square, planted. And she did not give Renfrew the gift of seeing them land. But she did do one thing. She waited for the silence to get good and deep. And then she said, quietly, into it, "There it is." Just that. There it is. And every head turned to her. "That's the man, Your Honor," she said, plain and even. "That's what's under the fine coat and the patient smile
and the year of squeezing. He didn't raise Amos Colter's fees because of business, and he didn't file this petition because of the public interest.
He did it because he looked at a grieving man and a fat woman, and he decided we weren't real people, that we were a joke, an ox and a nobody, and that things like us aren't allowed to hold on to anything a man like him decides he wants. That's the whole story, right there in his own words, finally. And I'll tell you what I told a mill hand named Boyd on my first morning in that valley, Your Honor, because it's the only wisdom I've got, and it's held up my whole life. She looked at Renfrew, and there was no hate in her face, which was somehow worse for him than hate. Wood doesn't lie. Either it holds or it doesn't, no matter how pretty it's painted. And a man doesn't lie either in the end. He can varnish it a whole year, but sooner or later he shows you what he's made of. And you just showed the whole room, Mr. Renfrew. You held for a year, and then you didn't. Judge Harlan Voss set his spectacles down on the table with a small, precise click that was the loudest sound in the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his tired old voice had gone hard and flat, "Mr. Renfrew, in 40 years on this bench I have been lied to by experts, and I have learned that a man's petition and a man's character are not always the same thing. And I do try, to judge the petition and not the man. But every so often a man is good enough to hand me both at once." He gathered the manifests and Prudence Hallett's ledger and squared them. "I've got before me a signed record showing the Colter Landing ran double its required volume this season. I've got fee notices showing your mill raised this man's costs 3 times, while you prepared to claim he'd abandoned his rights, which is a contradiction you have not explained, and I don't believe you can. I've got sworn word that your own counsel seeded slander in that town to shame this man off his land. And I've got, just now, out of your own mouth, exactly the contempt that a scheme like this one runs on." He looked up. "Your petition is denied. The Colter grant stands, active and in good standing. And I'll note in my ruling that it appears to be more active this winter than it has been in years, thanks in no small part to the hauler standing in front of me." It should have ended there. But Judge Voss was not quite done, because 40 years had put something in the old man that wanted, just once in a while, to see a thing set all the way right. "Furthermore," he said, "Mrs. Hallett's testimony and these fee records raise questions about your business practices in that valley that I intend to refer to the territorial attorney for a closer look. And Mr. Atwater, a word of counsel to you. One officer of the court to a man who's about to have trouble calling himself one. Choose your clients like you'd choose a beam to stand under. Either it holds or it doesn't." And he rapped the table once, and it was done. There was no applause in that hearing room, because it was a court and not a chapel. But there was a sound, a low, exhaled sound from the handful of onlookers on the back benches, rivermen and clerks and idlers who'd wandered in. And it was the sound of a room that had watched a rich man get taken apart by the truth, and was glad of it. And that sound, low and warm and unanimous, was its own kind of witness clap, the crowd shifting all at once from watching to being on her side. Silas Renfrew gathered his fine coat and walked out of that room with his back straight and his face white. And he did not look at Della Rourke, and he was never, in the end, quite the power in that valley again. Because a man like Renfrew rules by seeming untouchable, and the whole county seat had just watched him be touched. And word of it ran up the river ahead of the melt, the way the good stories do. And the timber towns that had feared him began, quietly,
to stop.
The referral to the territorial attorney came to something, in time, though that is a longer and duller story than this one. A matter of ledgers and fines and Atwater losing his license, and Renfrew selling his mill within 2 years and moving on to some other valley to be patient in. And I will not spend your evening on it. What matters is that he was beaten, and he was beaten not by a bigger power, but by the plain truth said plainly by the people he'd been too contemptuous to see clearly. Out on the courthouse steps in the thin spring sun, Amos Colter stood next to Della Rourke and could not, for a while, say anything at all. The land was saved. The landing was his, free and clear, active and in good standing, the thing Renfrew had spent a year and a fortune trying to take. And it was still his. And it was still his because a woman had walked down his road in October and refused to load slow. He looked at her. Prudence Hallett had come out onto the steps too, red-eyed, and she stood a little apart, unsure now whether she was allowed to be near them. And Della saw that. And Della Rourke crossed to Prudence Hallett and did the thing that told you everything about who Della was, which was that she did not gloat, and she did not lecture, and she did not make the woman grovel. She held out her big, scarred hand.
"That was brave," Della said. "What you did in there. 2 days on a cold stage to tell the truth on a powerful man? That took more than lifting lumber. I want you to know I know that."
And Prudence Hallett looked at the offered hand, and then she took it. And then she did a thing she had not planned and could not have planned. She stepped in and put her arms around the large woman she had spent a winter wronging, and she wept into Della's shoulder. And Della stood there in the spring sun on the courthouse steps and held the frightened woman who had finally chosen the truth. And over Prudence's shaking shoulder she met Amos Colter's eyes, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than the thing itself. They stayed the night in the county seat and started home in the morning, the 3 of them now, Prudence riding in the wagon bed among the empty oilcloth wrappings, and the ride home was easier than the ride out, the roads drying, the light lengthening, the whole valley tipping over into spring. And somewhere on that second day, with Prudence dozing in the back, Amos said, quiet, eyes on the team, "When we get back." "Things will be different in town now, after this."
"Probably."
"The wondering will stop." He was quiet a moment. "The other thing, though." And he stopped, the old Colter way, the sentence too large. And Della Rourke, sitting the box beside him with the spring light on the drying road, knew exactly what the other thing was, because it had been growing between them all winter like water finding its channel. And she knew that Amos Colter was trying, in his halting, careful way, to say a thing he had not let himself say to a living soul since the January he buried his family. And she loved him too much, she realized with a small shock at the size of the word she'd just used, even inside her own head. Love. She loved him too much to make him finish the sentence alone. So she finished it with him.
"The other thing doesn't have to be a thing yet," she said gently. "It can just be true and not spoken, for now. I've waited 39 years, Amos. I'm not in a hurry."
"And I'd rather you say it when it's a choice than when it's a relief." And Amos Colter looked at her sideways, surprised, the way he'd looked at her that first morning when she took the lines. And then he nodded, slow, and looked back at the road, and something in his shoulders eased, and they rode the rest of the way home in the good, easy quiet that was their native language, while behind them Prudence Hallett slept, and the spring came on, and the coal each of them had carried cupped and hidden all winter glowed a little warmer, a little surer, not spoken, but true. Spring in the timber country is a kind of forgiveness, And Slater's Bend that spring was a town remaking itself. And the remaking touched Della Rourke in ways she had never once in her life let herself expect. The wandering did stop, as Amos had said it would, and it stopped fast, because the story of the land office had run up the river ahead of them. The story of how the Colter woman had stood up in a judge's own room and taken Renfrew apart with a stack of raft tallies, and how respectable Prudence Hallett had ridden 2 days to weep the truth on the steps, and a town that had spent a winter wondering about Della Rourke spent a spring instead telling that story. And in the telling, she stopped being the fat woman down at the landing and started being the hauler who beat Renfrew. And that is the thing about a town. It will pin an identity on you either way, and the only question is, which one? And Della's had changed, and with it, changed everything. Prudence Hallett told the store, and Prudence Hallett, having been the loudest carrier of the wondering, became now the loudest carrier of the correction. And there is no advocate on this earth like a person working off a debt of conscience. And Prudence worked hers off with a will. She stopped short-weighting the flour. She started, in fact, overweighting it a little, small, guilty thumbs on the scale in the other direction. And she and Della never spoke of it, and both of them knew. And it became a kind of quiet joke between them, the overweighted flour, the way Amos's "huh?" was a joke, the way the coat had been. And the town followed Prudence, the way towns follow whoever seems surest. And one by one, the timber wives who had turned stiff faces to Della at the well began to nod to her, and then to speak to her. And then, that summer, to ask her opinion on a lame horse or a cracked axle. Because it turned out that once you stopped seeing the size of Della Rourke, you could not help but see the competence of her. And competence, in a hard country, is the thing that finally buys a person in. Ott Klein came to supper regular now, and Pete practically lived at the landing, and had been promised by Amos that he could learn the freight trade proper come fall, and would someday, everyone understood, drive a wagon of his own, and the sagging Colter place began, slow, to unsag, because there were hands now, and there was money now. The landing running full and free with the season's timber, and the fees back to fair. And Della and Amos rebuilt the corral fence right this time, the two of them, on a long gold evening in May. And when it was done, Amos leaned on the finished rail and looked at it and said, "Huh." And Della leaned next to him and said, "Holds." And it did. It held. The fence and the horses and the whole made thing of their days together. It held. And here I want to slow us down again, because I've told you a great deal about the winning of things, the land office and the fence and the town coming round. And those are good, and I'm glad of them. But they are not what this story is about. And I don't want you to think they are, because a person can win every fight and rebuild every fence and still go to bed at night in the old, cold loneliness, still be needed and not wanted, still be the ox and the nobody in the one silent room that matters, which is the room inside their own chest. Winning is not the same as belonging. I have known people who won their whole lives and belonged nowhere. And the thing Della Rourke had never had, the thing all the winning in the world could not have handed her, was still that gold spring, unspoken between her and the man leaning on the fence beside her, the coal still cupped and hidden, true but not said, waiting on a free choice. It waited through the spring. It waited because Amos Colter was a careful man and a wounded one, and because he had told a woman he loved once that he loved her, and then watched the ground take her and their boy both. And a man who has learned that loving a thing out loud is the same as marking it for the grave, does not easily say the word a second time. And it waited because Della, who had been needed her whole life and wanted never, had told him true on the wagon that she'd rather he say it when it was a choice than when it was a relief. And she had meant it. And she was not going to reach across and take the thing herself, because the thing you reach across and take is not the thing she wanted. The thing she wanted had to be given, freely, or it was just being needed again in a prettier coat. It was the loyal old dog that finally moved it in the end, or the dog and a summer storm together, and I love that it was, because that dog had been the first to know that first wet October afternoon. That dog had forgiven Della before either of the humans would let themselves, and it was fitting that the dog should be the one to knock the last stone loose. It happened in July. A summer storm came down the valley fast and mean the way they do, and the dog, who was old now, older than anyone had reckoned, had wandered up the grade after a smell the way dogs do, and did not come back before the storm. And Amos and Della went out into the wind and the driving rain to find it. And they found it at last down near the river's edge, where the bank had gone slick, having slipped and hurt its hip, and unable to climb the wet bank, lying there patient and shivering and glad, so glad to see them, its tail moving in the mud. And Amos Colter went down that slick bank in the rain and gathered the big old dog up in his arms, all its heavy, soaked weight. And he carried it back up, and the dog licked his face the whole way, and Della walked beside them, steadying Amos on the slick ground with a hand on his back. And they got the dog home, and dried it, and set its hip as best they could, and made it a bed by the stove. And it lay there, the old gray dog, exhausted and content, looking up at the two of them with its wise old eyes. And Amos knelt by it, stroking its head, soaked through. And he said, not to Della, to the dog, low, "Don't you go doing that. Don't you go slipping off. I've buried enough. I can't." And his voice broke, and he stopped. And Della Rourke, standing there dripping in the lamplight, watched Amos Colter kneel over a hurt old dog, and finally say out loud the thing that had ruled his whole grieving life: "I've buried enough. I can't." And she understood in that moment with a terrible tenderness that this was the whole of it. This was the lock on the man. This was why the coal stayed cupped and hidden and unspoken. Because Amos Colter had decided somewhere in that frozen January 4 years back that the safest thing, the only bearable thing, was to never again love something out loud where the world could hear him and come take it. And she understood that he had broken that rule just now, kneeling in a puddle for a dog, and that the rule, once broken even for a dog, could not be put back together whole, and that if she was ever going to be wanted and not just needed, if the coal was ever going to catch, it was going to be now, in the storm, over the old dog that had known first. So she knelt down too, across the dog from him, and she put her big scarred hand on the dog's flank next to his hand, and she said, quiet, under the drum of the rain, "You haven't buried enough. You've buried too much. That's not the same thing." He looked up at her. "And I'll tell you a true thing, Amos, because true is the only thing I know how to say. And I've been saving this one because I wanted you to be the one to say it first. And I finally figured out that you can't. That the grief took the saying first out of you, and it's not coming back. And that if I keep waiting for you to say it first, I'll be waiting at the bottom of a bank in the rain forever." She took a breath.
I love you. There. A great ox of a nobody loves you, Amos Colter, and has since about the time we fixed that cracked wheel in the dark, and you laughed. And I'm not saying it to be answered, and I'm not saying it to be needed. I'm saying it because it's true, and because somebody in this house has got to be brave enough to love a thing out loud. And it's plain it's not going to be you, so it's going to have to be me. And I've got the shoulders for it. For a long moment, Amos Colter said nothing, kneeling there in the lamplight with the rain on the roof and the old dog breathing slow between them, and his soaked hair dripping and his face doing a dozen things at once. And Della Rourke knelt across from him with her heart, for the first time in her whole guarded life, laid out plain on the floor where he could step on it if he chose, and she made herself hold still and let him, because a thing given freely has to risk being refused, or it isn't given at all. And then Amos Colter reached across the old dog and took her face in his two rough hands, the way she'd once let herself be held for the first time at a kitchen table. And he looked at her like a man looking at morning light through a window he'd nailed shut years ago and forgotten he could open. And he said, in a voice wrecked and low, and steadier than she'd ever heard it, "I can't say it first. You're right. The saying first is gone out of me, and I hate it. And I'm sorry. And it's true." He swallowed. "But I can say it second. I've been able to say it second for months, and been too scared to get there. So say it again. Say it again and let me say it second. And I swear to you, I'll say it second every day for the rest of my life, if you'll just always be brave enough to say it first." And Della Rourke laughed, a wet, broken laugh with tears in it. Tears that were not weakness, but the plainest release, the coal catching at last into open flame. And she said, "I love you, Amos Colter." And Amos Colter said, "I love you too. Second. But I mean it as much as if I was first." And he kissed her, over the old hurt dog, in the lamplight, with the storm coming down on the timber and the river running full and free below them. And the dog thumped its tail once against the floor, satisfied, the way it had wanted the world arranged since October. And outside, the rain came down and washed the whole valley clean. They were married in the finished chapel at the end of that summer, and here is a thing worth telling you about the wedding, because it pays off the winter. The chapel was full. The whole valley came, the timber wives and the mill hands and the raft crews, Ott Klein in his stiff collar, grumbling and secretly pleased, Pete grinning like the sun, and Prudence Hallett, who had helped sew the dress, a dress cut generous, cut in Della's true size, a dress that fit, weeping in the front bench, the good kind of weeping. The same chapel that had gone stiff and silent when the two of them walked in at Christmas was on its feet and glad when they walked out of it, man and wife. And that turning, from the stiff silence to the glad crowd, from the wondering to the witnessing, is the whole distance this story travels. And it is a distance measured not in miles, but in being seen. And Della Rourke walked it in less than a year, on the strength of her own two hands and her own plain truth, and one man brave enough, in the end, to love her second. Silas Renfrew was not there, of course. Silas Renfrew was gone by then, or going. His power leaked away, his name a cautionary thing. And I want to say one more word about him before I let him go out of the story for good. Because I promised you at the start that cruelty would be shown, plainly, and never celebrated. And I've shown you his. And here is the plain truth of it, the moral of Renfrew, if he has one. He lost not because Della was stronger than him. She wasn't. He had money and law and a whole town's fear, and she had a wagon and the truth. He lost because he could not see. He looked at a grieving man and a large woman, and he saw an ox and a nobody, a joke, a thing beneath his notice. And because he could not see them, he could not imagine them. And because he could not imagine them, he did not guess that they would get up in the dark and load their own wagon, and keep a book of every raft, and walk into a judge's room unafraid. Contempt made him blind, and blindness beat him. That is how it usually goes with his kind, in my experience, though not always, and not soon enough. But often enough that I'll ask you to hold on to it. The people who look at you and see a nobody are telling you the exact measure of their own blindness. And blindness, in the end, loses to sight. I told you at the beginning that I'd bring you back to the hill, and I keep my promises. So let me bring you back to it, because that image I opened on, the woman stepping under the falling load while the men ran, that happened. And it happened after everything else I've told you, in the second autumn. And it is where I want to leave you, because it holds the whole of what I've been trying to say. It was a year after the wedding, near enough. The outfit was thriving by then. Colter and Rourke freight, the sign painted by Pete, who drove his own wagon now, and there were 3 teams and 4 haulers, and the landing ran full from thaw to freeze. And Della and Amos worked it side by side the way they had from the first. Partners in the trade, and in the house, and in the bed, and in the long, good quiet of their days. And on a bright, hard October afternoon, a new hauler, a young man named Cobb, green and eager, lost the brake on a full load coming down the river grade, the killing grade. And the wagon began to slide, and then to tip at the washed edge, and Cobb's boot caught in the tongue as he tried to jump. And he went down in front of 2,000 pounds of green fur with his foot pinned, screaming. And every other man on that hillside did what men do. They ran. They saved themselves. And I don't blame them. I want you to know I don't blame them. It is the most human thing in the world to run from a mountain coming down. But Della Rourke did not run. Della Rourke was 30 yards up the hill, and she saw the boy go down, and she saw the load coming, and she did the arithmetic in the half-second she had, the arithmetic she'd been doing her whole life, the weight and the balance, and where the true center of a falling thing really lives. And she saw that there was one place, where a body planted just so against the sliding stack might hold it the 2 seconds it would take the boy to drag his foot free. And she went to that place. Not running, not riding, just walking, fast and sure and certain, the way she'd walked toward the dog in the rain, and toward Renfrew in the chapel, and toward every hard thing her whole hard life. And she set her shoulder against the load, and she planted her boots in the dirt, and she took the whole sliding weight of it onto her own broad body, the body the world had spent 39 years telling her to apologize for. And that body, that great, strong ox of a body, that body a rich man had called a joke in a court of law, held. It held. For 2 seconds. For 3, straining, her boots plowing furrows in the dirt, every muscle she owned screaming. Della Rourke held 2,000 pounds of falling timber on the strength of the self she'd been shamed for her whole life. And the boy Cobb dragged his pinned foot free and rolled clear. And the instant he was clear, Della let herself drop and roll the other way, and the load came down where she'd been standing, with a crash that shook the hill. And then it was over, and there was dust and silence, and the boy alive in the dirt, and Della Rourke on her back looking up at the hard blue October sky, breathing, alive, whole. And the men came running back now that it was safe, and they gathered around, white-faced, and someone helped her up. And Cobb was weeping and grabbing her hands and trying to thank her, and she was telling him gruffly to hush. And Amos came down that hill at a dead run with his heart in his mouth, and reached her, and did not say anything at all, just took her face in his two rough hands, and pressed his forehead to hers, and shook. And she said, quiet, just for him, "I'm all right." Held, didn't it? And Amos laughed the wet, broken laugh, and said, "It held." And the men on that hillside, the same rough timber men who 2 autumns back had called her names from a barrel on the plank walk, looked at the woman who had just done the thing none of them had dared to do. And one of them started it, and then they all did. They took off their hats, and they stood there on the killing grade in the October light with their hats in their hands, in front of the great, strong ox of a woman who had walked under a falling mountain to save a boy's foot. And that was the witness clap. That was the whole town's verdict come round at last. Hats off on a hillside. And it was worth more than all the applause in the world, because it was silent, and it was earned, and it was true. Now let me step out of the story and sit with you a moment, the way I promised I would at the start, before I let you go back to your evening. I don't know what town you're in tonight, though I hope you told me, down in the comments, so I could know who traveled all this way with me. And I don't know what the world has told you that you are. But I have a strong feeling, because of the kind of person who stays to the end of a story like this one, that somewhere along your road, somebody looked at you and saw an ox, or a nobody, or a problem, or a number, or a body, or a sad story, and told you that was all you were, and maybe told you often enough and young enough that some cold morning you started to believe them, and started making yourself smaller, and started apologizing for the room you take up just by being alive. So I want to tell you the true things, because true is the only comfort that doesn't wear off, and I've got a few of them, and they're the same ones Della Rourke knew, and I want you to carry them out of here, small and careful, in the place where you keep the few you've been given. The first is this. The thing they shamed you for may be the very thing that one day holds the load. The size, the strangeness, the too much of you, the part they told you to hide, is not your flaw. It is very often your strength wearing the mask of a flaw, and the world that shames it is simply too blind to see what it's looking at. And blindness, remember, loses to sight in the end. The second true thing is about being needed and being wanted, because I've watched a lot of people confuse them and settle for the first because they'd given up on the second. And I want to tell you not to settle. There is a difference as wide as a river between someone gripping you like a tool because you're useful and someone holding you like a treasure because you're you. And you are allowed, however old you are, however long you've waited, however many towns have wondered about you, to hold out for the far bank. Della Rourke was 39 before she felt her hand held like a treasure for the first time. It is never too late. It was not too late for her, and it is not too late for you. And I need you to hear that tonight, wherever you are. And the third true thing, the last one, the one I most want you to take, is about worth and how it's won. Nobody grants it to you. No town, no rich man, no judge, no crowd with its hats off. They only ever recognize it, late, after you've already proven it, with your own 2 hands, in the dark, before anyone was watching, loading the wagon alone because it was the work that needed doing.
Your worth is not a number that other people assign to you. It was never theirs to assign. It is the plain fact of what you're made of, and like wood, like a fence, like a man, in the end it comes down to one thing and one thing only, and it is the thing Della said to a cruel man on her first morning, and to a judge on her hardest day, and to the one she loved in a storm. Either it holds or it doesn't. And you, my friend, you who stayed all the way to the end of a quiet hour with me tonight, you have been holding a load most people never see, for longer than anyone has thanked you for, and I want to be the one to take my hat off to you now, across all the miles, and tell you what nobody may have told you in a long while. I see you. Not the size of you the world argues about, the strength of you underneath it, the part that gets up in the dark and holds. It's real, and it's yours, and it was always enough. And somewhere up ahead of you on the road, there is a place to stop, and a hand that will hold yours like a treasure, and a load that only you were ever strong enough to catch. Keep walking toward it. Not running, not riding, just walking, sure and steady, the way the good things always come. Thank you for giving me your evening, and your attention, and this quiet hour. Tell me in the comments the thing they once shamed you for that turned out to be your strength, because I read them, and because somebody else who needs to hear it will read it too. And until the next quiet hour we share, be steady, be seen, and remember, whatever they've told you, that you were always the one strong enough to hold. Go gentle, and go held.